Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to another installment of SchoolHouse Connection's advocacy training series, Educating the New Congress, a step-by-step advocacy training series for homeless educators and service providers. I will be sharing my screen in a bit. But today's installment, so we are going to be covering Shining. This is part 4 out of the 6-part series. It's entitled Shining a Light Using Media and Social Media to Boost Legislative Advocacy. We're just having a bit of technical difficulties right now. I'm trying to share the screen. But we'll be with everyone in a second.
And just while we're waiting for that to get started, I thought we could introduce ourselves. My name is Aarti, and I am a senior account executive at Rally. We are an issue advocacy communications firm, and we've been working with SchoolHouse Connection for over a year now, or on the child, youth, and family homelessness issue. And I'll pass it off to my colleague Devin as well, who's with me.
Hi, I'm Devin McMahon, and I'm an account associate at Rally. I'm excited to be here today.
So sorry, everyone, for these technical difficulties. As you can tell, this is the first time that I've done this side of the presentation, but we are getting there. Okay. Okay, and of course, SchoolHouse Connection, most of you may be familiar with SchoolHouse. We are a national nonprofit, if this is your first time joining us, and we focus on overcoming homelessness through education, through advocacy work, and also technical assistance and implementation work. You can also find out more on our website, www.schoolhouseconnection.org. And we also encourage you to sign up for our newsletter, because you'll get important updates on our resources and webinars like this, policy updates, etc. So all of the good stuff will be there. Like I mentioned, and Aarti and Devin gave a bit of a background on today's webinar. We're going to be discussing using shining a light, using media and social media to boost legislative advocacy, how to engage parents and we're going to be doing how to use media and social media to boost legislative advocacy. And before we get into today's webinar, just going to do a quick recap on last week's presentation, and also the previous 2 installments that we've had. So in the first session, we covered the the importance of constituent engagement. So basically why we're all here, the dynamics of the 117th Congress, the difference between advocacy and lobbying. The second session, we covered the best strategies for communicating with Congress, effective meeting tips in terms of preparation, how to prepare for a meeting with a member of Congress or a member of their staff, what to do during the meeting, and also follow up and do's and don'ts. The last thing we covered in the session was online and how to engage online and other forms of advocacy. And in the third session, we covered entering the advocacy space and the impact that it can have. And we heard from our peers for this segment, why they make time for advocacy and also significant lessons learned while engaging in advocacy. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Aarti and Devin.
Thank you. Oh, great timing. And thank you all for joining us. Welcome to part 4 of SchoolHouse Connection's advocacy training series. So today we're going to be talking a bit about how to use local and social media to amplify your voice and target your audience or target your messages directly towards policymakers. And even though much of this presentation will be tactic oriented, so showing you how to do these things, if there's one thing you take away from this presentation, we really hope that it's an understanding of why you can and should do these things. Because we understand that advocacy can be daunting and that it's not in your job description. It may not be something you have experience in, and it may you may think you don't have time for it. But we want to make clear right off the bat that we're not asking you to walk the halls of Congress after this presentation, but that the fight for children, youth, and families experiencing homelessness really needs advocates at every level. And we're here to tell you that there are so many ways to be an advocate that will fit with your skill set and bandwidth and comfort level, and will be really important in moving the needle on this issue. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. There we
I'm so sorry.
No problem. It happens. There we go. Perfect. So why media? The media, whether that be news media or social media, is intended to be a reflection of what is happening around you. And that includes the issues affecting people around you and sometimes solutions to those very issues. And policymakers and their staff look to the media to understand what issues need to be addressed with policy and resources which they can provide. It's of course their job to do that, but it's also frankly in their best interest in terms of re-election. So naturally then, the media is an incredibly powerful tool for agenda setting for our policymakers. And while we can influence policymakers with articles and op-eds on child, youth, and family homelessness, on social media, we can take it one step further and engage with them directly. So tagging them in posts and responding to their posts. And we will dig into all of this and more throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. Perfect. So we also want to make sure you're all clear on why you are particularly important voices for advocacy in this space. As homeless educators and service providers, you bring the heart to advocacy. So you have the stories and human emotional aspect that is so often lost, yet is so important, because data can only go so far in terms of informing people. It's really the stories and the human interest that really moves people to action. You're also important voices because you know the issue firsthand. We need local advocates at every level to educate and ultimately pressure policymakers for supportive policy. And like I said earlier, we hope that you can take away from this training that it's low risk and really high reward, and your voice really does matter, and you really are already an advocate, whether you consider yourself one or not. And lastly, many organizations actually have legal limitations on engaging with legislation, so even in a tweet, because it's considered lobbying. But individuals are not subject to this same limitation, so it's really important to utilize that important power. So now I'll pass it on to Aarti.
Great. And if we could move to the next slide. I think actually it's on the next slide.
I just want to say that I am not sure why this keeps on happening. I keep pressing the button one time. I'm so sorry, everyone.
No, it's okay. No worries. I think if we could go to slide 10. Perfect. Thank you. So we just wanted to emphasize again why local media is important to policymakers. So essentially what it boils down to is that politicians are looking to local news to find a reflection of community conversations. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that news needs to reach national outlets and be at the national level to be of note to policymakers. And the reality is that local media is so much more important for policymakers than national news and national outlets, because policymakers need to address the needs of their local constituents. So these local outlets are the place where their staffers pay close attention. So it's really where we recommend you focus capacity for op-eds and letters to the editor and pitching stories. Like Devin was saying before, local media can really drive legislative priority setting. It can shift policymakers' attention to a policy problem or a particular solution. As I said before, they want to read what their constituents are reading. They want to stay in tune with concerns and issues affecting them, because if they're not delivering on those issues, that might cost them their position. So media is a great way to create urgency around an issue and prompt leaders to take action or prioritize the issue. They also, policymakers and their staffers do closely follow how the media covers legislation, both how the legislation shapes up, as well as how their role in shaping this legislation is covered. So if child, youth, and family homelessness is largely covered in local media, seen as an urgent issue in the community, and a policymaker is not perceived as taking action on it, media can be used as a tool for accountability and to call this out and light a fire under them through things like op-eds and letters to the editor, as I was saying. So if we could move to the next slide. We want to get folks thinking a little bit about a question around what makes a compelling story to legislators. And I think you can, we'll put it in the chat in case folks have other ideas, but basically what it boils down to is, if you were a policymaker, what kind of story would grab your attention and move you? What do you look for? And these are a few things that we've seen as common components of the different stories that tend to get coverage and catch the attention of policymakers. So the first are stories with frontline and expert voices. Storytelling is powerful and often the thing that moves people and gets people to better understand an issue and its impacts through the lens of an individual story. And people are also more likely to trust a voice who is an expert and works on the front lines of the issue, like a McKinney-Vento liaison. Obviously, timeliness is a big factor. Tying your story or your coverage or your op-ed to legislation, like the stimulus or current events. Obviously, COVID-19 is sort of the overarching hook right now. So you want to make sure that you tie to relevant hooks and make sure that your pieces are timely. The reality too is that there's a lot of different issues and stakeholders and organizations who are vying for limited resources right now as COVID-19 recovery takes shape. So it also helps to show the connection of your issue, such as child, youth, and family homelessness, to other high priority end of pipeline issues and narratives. So for example, child, youth, and family homelessness is very connected to adult mental health and addiction and poverty cycles. So it helps to fuse those narratives to show just how high the stakes are around child and youth homelessness if it's not addressed. There's also, we've seen a lot of ties between child, youth, and family homelessness and the conversations around anti-racism and equity, because children who are homeless are disproportionately students of color, students who live with disabilities, and students who are English learners. So that's something that we've also seen as well. And the final, I think, strong component of compelling coverage is data and evidence. This is something that policymakers really consider. They are actively looking at how addressing this issue will help address these other issues or save X amount of money in taxpayer dollars. So data and evidence essentially helps connect the dots between an issue and a solution or an outcome. And it also helps show the scale of the issue and build urgency around it. If there are thousands of children in your community that are experiencing homelessness, this is the kind of data that really catches attention. So if we could move to the next slide. So this is an example of a piece from local Detroit news about a former homelessness liaison who now works as a board secretary at Covenant House Academy, which is a tuition-free charter school where a third of students have experienced homelessness. And we bring this up as an example of some of the components we just talked about. It's obviously very timely with the COVID-19 pandemic. It features an expert voice and it hones in on an individual story to illustrate and show a larger issue. And it contained a lot of data. There were a lot of statistics in this piece about the number of students who had experienced homelessness, which students qualify for free reduced lunch, and that basically helped show the scale of the issue and support the individual story that this piece was focused on. So next slide. And this was a 60 Minutes piece featuring a McKinney-Vento liaison named Laura Tucker in Tampa, Florida. And similarly, this was a piece about the issue of missing students and students lacking support. And it zeroed in on Laura and the issue in Tampa to drive the point home and help people understand how this issue is tangibly playing out at a local level. So these are just two pieces of coverage to consider as you're identifying and pitching stories at your local media levels. And so next slide. So how can you shape a compelling story? Above all, I think the most compelling stories come from what you know and want to share. So ultimately, you decide what to share and how to share it. You are in control of the story. And if this is internalized, you are inherently going to shape a very strong story. So I just want to make that point clear to everyone on the call that it is really up to what you want to share and what you know. And there is no pressure to share anything beyond that. It helps to know your message, to have 3 key messages to consistently tie back to that also speak to your audience values and priorities. So effective messaging is always consistent, audience focused. It should be brief and pithy and strong. It should sound natural rolling off the tongue because that's what is often most understandable to the ear. And these others we've discussed before, but use supportive facts when you can. Data and evidence is obviously very important. Avoid jargon and complex statistics because oftentimes the people consuming these stories and reading your coverage are well beyond the issue area and may not have the level of in-depth expertise that you do. So it helps to keep the message high level and to avoid jargon when possible. And involve stories and voices that illustrate the issue. Again, this is really what moves people and prompts people to act. So it's always an asset. So we can move to the next slide. And just a couple of things about how you can connect earned media stories to advocacy. Oftentimes, social media is one of the fastest and most effective ways to amplify earned coverage. And you can see an example here from SchoolHouse Connection of a post that amplified a very strong piece of coverage. And you can use social media to post the article, tag outlets, tag policymakers with a call to action so their staffers see your post, and potentially flag it, like it, retweet it. So don't hold back when it comes to sharing strong pieces of coverage on social media. Next slide. And in terms of another way to connect earned media to advocacy, we understand that a lot of the folks on the call might be in direct touch with offices and staffers of elected officials. So we always recommend tying in notable coverage to correspondence with them. So you can see an example here of including notable coverage in an email. It could either be a standalone email, just completely focused on that piece of coverage, or you could tie in pieces of coverage to emails regarding specific calls to action or developments. But essentially, by ensuring that they see these pieces of coverage and by ensuring that they get in front of staffers, you can help make sure that they know that it's a priority for your organization and for your constituency. And I think we can move on to the next slides, and I'm going to pass it over to Devin to go over social media.
Thank you. So social media is a wonderful resource for advocacy because compared to other advocacy tools, it really has a low barrier to entry, so anyone can do it. So if you're trying to get your feet wet in advocacy, this is a great place to start. It's also a really powerful agenda setting tool like news media because elected officials and their staff are using it. All organizations and advocates in the space are using it, and so are reporters. And all three of those groups are actively paying attention to relevant local conversations on social media in the same exact way that they do on local media. So we've compiled some best practices for engaging with elected officials on social media. Some of these may seem obvious because they're likely things you see on social media every day. That doesn't mean it's necessarily intuitive when you're writing posts yourself. So there's just a few boxes to tick to do this engagement really well. So that's what we're going to cover. So first things first, on all the platforms, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, you name it, Twitter is by far the best for reaching policymakers. And that's because the platform is centered around news and response to news, and because policymakers actively use it. And even more, the way Twitter is structured, so with retweet functionality, likes showing up on your homepage, like a post itself, and the ability to track hashtags, it's all very conducive to like external facing allyship. So to be a really good ally in this movement, to be a good player in coalition politics, it's really common practice on Twitter to be actively engaging with the issue and activists on the platform. And that's all super easy to do by simply liking, retweeting, quote tweeting, and tagging others in your posts. And you can and should do the same process for engaging directly with policymakers. So by tagging them in your posts and liking and retweeting and quote tweeting them. It's always also best to use graphics when possible. So they're more eye-catching and always perform better on social platforms. And lastly, we recommend tweet threads as a great way to get around that character count and say a lot more than that, what you can say in a single tweet. With SchoolHouse, we use them quite a bit, and we'll show you an example of that shortly. Next slide, please. Perfect. So writing posts. So let's say you read an article about a terrible bill that you know would harm students experiencing homelessness, and you decide you're going to tweet about it. So here are a couple of things to keep in mind. So first, your audience. So likely the policymaker you're going to tag, as well as your own followers. So like Aarti mentioned, in local media, in social media, you're also going to want to avoid jargon and make sure you explain the issue in terms that are clear and concise and accessible to understand. You're also going to want to use hashtags to algorithmically reach more individuals following the issue. So we always hashtag homelessness, for example, but depending on your post, there may be other keywords you'll want to hashtag. Again, use images if possible. They grab attention. And always make sure there's a clear, actionable takeaway. There's a time and a place for a good rant, but an effective tweet tagging a policymaker shouldn't be a rant. It should be an education on the issue and a legislative call to action. Next slide, please. So now we're going to give you some examples of what we're talking about here, and we want to try to bring in a little bit of discussion over the chat box. So Aarti just dropped in the chat, but please let us know in the chat box what makes this a good example of a social media post engaging policymakers. I'll give you all a few minutes on that. It's not a quiz. Well, I'll go ahead and share some reasons we think this is a good example. We like that this post tagged a policymaker. We like that it used a relevant hashtag. It also uses a great visual, and there's a really clear call to action. Next slide, please. Great, and we'll do the same thing here. You can let us know over the chat what makes this a strong post. No need to be shy. We want to hear what you have to say. But no worries. We like that this tweet tags policymakers and is clear about what they're asking of them. But a few ideas on how this tweet could be better. It would have been great to have included an article on why they're calling for this. They also could have made this a tweet thread to have said a bit more themselves on why this is important. And of course, if they had created a visual shareable graphic, that always helps. Next slide, please. So this is a great example of a Twitter thread. So this is a statement put out on Twitter with hashtags, great tags. They tagged HUD, a graphic which was used to catch eyes and also include additional information. There's a clear call to action, and it links to a Medium piece to share additional information. Now, this is maybe hard to read small on a screen, but we'll share on this deck afterwards to take a look. Next slide, please. Another great tactic for social media is tweet storms. So tweet storms are a tactic to create noise and show clear, widespread support of an issue or a solution by coordinating posts with partners and allies. And what results is really like a virtual protest. So you see in mass people rallying around an issue. And with that mass comes much greater attention and pressure for our policymakers. So how do you launch a tweet storm? So first you want to identify your call to action and policymakers targets to tag. You want to select a dedicated day and time for your tweet storm. You're going to want to draft posts with a unique hashtag and graphics. And if you get enough people to post, you might be able to get your hashtag trending, which would get way more eyeballs on those tweets and really goes the extra mile in creating a buzz. Then you want to recruit allies and partners to post in the tweet storm and provide them with the posts and hashtags and individuals to tag. And then you start tweeting and retweeting on the selected day and time. Next slide, please. So here's an example of a tweet storm in action. So you can see here there's a great clear graphic and a policymaker tag as well. And they actually shared out a toolkit with reposting materials, so anyone who sees this tweet can be a part of the tweet storm with fairly minimal effort. So yeah, it's a great one. Next slide, please. And last but not least, we cannot recommend enough planning your social media posts with a content calendar. Calendars help you look forward to plan ahead for newsworthy moments and touch points in legislation that you might want to plan your posts and calls to action around. So here's an example of one that we've used before, which has hashtags, slots for drafted posts, and the different iterations of those posts across platforms. And some examples of dates we might want to build into a content calendar, if we were to make one for you today, could be the passage of the upcoming stimulus bill. Maybe you want to say something about the exciting inclusion of dollars for students experiencing homelessness. Maybe the end of the school year. International Women's Day was yesterday, and I'm sure you probably saw organizations and even companies using that as a hook for posts. The options are endless, and a calendar just helps you plan ahead. Now I'll pass it over to Aarti to talk about expanding your reach.
Great. Next slide. So in the last few minutes of our presentation before we open it up to questions, if your organization has a budget of any kind for some digital advertising on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, we highly recommend it because it is one of the most effective ways to make sure your messages, your content, and calls to action are seen by your target audiences. We could honestly spend an entire 1 or 2 trainings just discussing digital advertising. So what we're going to spend the last few minutes here doing is just providing an overview and pointing you to some key resources. For the purpose of this audience, we recommend advertising on Facebook, which owns Instagram, and Twitter, because policymakers and policy adjacent audiences and activists are on these platforms. Twitter and Facebook also have relatively robust and user-friendly advertising infrastructure, so they tend to be the most popular for issue-related ads. Actually, could we go back to the next slide, please, Elian? Or sorry, yeah, back one slide. Actually, it should say digital advertising. Perfect, that's the one. So before you decide to advertise, it's really important to know your goal. Is it awareness, engagement, or mobilization? And I'm just going to talk through the differences between those. Awareness is really when you want to educate people on an issue and show why it's important to this audience. So it could be like an article or a resource that you're trying to amplify. With engagement, it's more of a two-way communication. So this is where folks are asking for things like likes and shares and comments, versus mobilization, which is driving actions, such as join here or RSVP here or sign here, donate here. And those are what we call conversions, when someone sees your ad and that converts into an action that you want. And it's great for things like growing your email list or followers, things like that. So once you've set your goal, you can then visit your budget. And the more targeted your audience is, the more you can optimize towards a goal and get more for your money's worth. So it's really important to know your targets and to narrowly target folks to efficiently spend your budget. So we obviously by geographic area, by demographics, by job titles and fields, these are all possible. So it's just something to think about if you move forward with this. And there are a couple of resources linked in the slide, and I'm actually going to drop them in the chat. I just dropped them in the chat of links where you can go to learn a little bit more about setting up ads for Facebook, Instagram, and for Twitter. So next slide, please. Great. So with measuring your reach, we're not going to get into this too deeply because the deck is going to be available later, and these are also available on the links that I posted. But there's a few success metrics per goal to measure the reach and success of your ads. If you're running awareness ads, you look for impressions, the number of times your ad was shown, reach, the number of unique people who saw your ad, and frequency, the number of times a person saw your ad. So essentially the reason that those are the success metrics is because you're just trying to get this information in front of people and make them aware. Versus engagement, obviously, like I said before, people are taking action on your ad in the forms of clicks and comments and reactions and shares. So that's obviously the success metric for engagement ads. And for mobilization, things like click-through rates, link clicks, the number of people who clicked on your link or post likely resulted in a conversion. So those are the things you want to keep in mind if you choose to run any of these sets of ads. And next slide, please. So if you don't have the budget for ads or the capacity to run and monitor these ads, there's also the option of boosting high-performing posts directly from your channels. So any post that you think is important enough, that contains some really notable content that you just want to boost out over the course of a period of time on your channels, this is something you can do directly from the post itself, as you can see by the screenshots. So usually about 15 bucks can get you an average of 3,000 views on your in terms of audience. So we recommend at least 50 bucks over the course of a week to get maximum reach, and using that as sort of a baseline budget. But again, this is something that is very searchable online and something that we recommend doing if you're a little bit lower on capacity or budget. And I'm going to pass it on to Devin for some final remarks before we open it up to questions.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, before we open up for questions, we just wanted to reiterate that we hope you learned from this presentation that you are already an advocate by virtue of your experience and your voice, and that advocacy is something everyone can and should do within what you're comfortable with and have the capacity for, because there's so much to gain for your organizations and for the children, youth, and families that you support. So with that, are there any questions that we can answer via the chat box? Go ahead and just drop them in.
We're just monitoring we're monitoring the chat box and the Q&A. I don't see any questions yet. But I do appreciate, I saw folks put in a few comments around what are examples and what made those particular posts strong. So I appreciate all those folks who participated. Thank you. So we have a question here from Catherine. I'm working with a youth action board in my county to end homelessness. What is the best way to promote our group? We don't have a large budget. Also, it's hard for us to keep consistent members. Okay. So with a challenge like that, I would say if the goal is to promote the group and then get other folks to engage, and you don't have as large of a budget, I would really take stock of who basically is in the youth action board, and what are the different networks and communications channels and folks that people know within that, because I would say that social media is always one of the strongest ways to get the word out. And if you have enough people locally who are posting the same content and using the same hashtags and tagging the same policymakers, then I would say you have a much higher chance of I think, getting noticed in local social media. So I always recommend that folks, when they're starting out, just take a step back and take stock of what communications channels and networks everybody has, and if there's any organizations that folks could reach out to or are connected to who could help you post and amplify about your organization. And I would say, and the reason I recommend social media at first instead of earned is because earned media often takes a little bit more capacity, and it's in terms of getting folks to engage, social media is often a lot faster and a lot more effective. So Devin, I don't know if you had anything to add there.
No, that sounds great. I saw we had one more question from Carol. We have one person that handles social media posting for our district, and sometimes it can be difficult to get her assistance in posting information for our department. Are there any suggestions to help us get the word out? I have a few thoughts on this. With social media, I kind of feel like bandwidth is everything in terms of creating a regular sort of cadence of posting. So some ways to go around that is the calendar can be very helpful in terms of just planning your posts. So instead of taking 30 minutes to an hour every day to try to see what to post and then drafting your post, it can be really helpful just to block off an hour and a half, even one day a week, and just write a bunch of posts for the weeks to make sure you have them planned out. I've found that super helpful personally, just giving yourself time to write a few in a row so you have some planned for the week. Also, having using email to make sure that you are communicating with other folks in your organization to ask if there's things that others want posted on your behalf, or on their behalf. So that's something that I've done before, just like making sure you get the word out that you are a resource to them if there are things to be amplified, because it can be tricky to constantly be searching for things. And then my last recommendation, but would be interested to hear your thoughts, Aarti, is also using retweeting as much as you can. And yeah, if there's always, there's always great opportunity in just amplifying things that other people have already posted. It does take time, of course, to like make sure you're finding the right things that are relevant to your work, but you don't always have to be, you know, recreating the wheel and writing new posts every time. You can be sharing what others are posting.
Yeah, I agree with that. And retweeting and liking and engaging on other people's posts is, and I would say this for both the questions we've gotten, doing those simple actions of interacting with other people's posts on social media is a great way for you to build your own followers, and likely make relationships that can help amplify your content in return. So even just like Devin was saying, taking a few minutes of scheduled time to draft posts, to just surf social media and be engaging and retweeting and liking. It's an investment at first of time, but it really pays off in the long run. Any other questions? I think those were the only two we have right now, but we can pause for another minute in case folks drop any additional ones in the chat.
All right, seeing none.
Alian, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, Alian, I know you run these things, so I'll defer to you. I don't think we have any other questions, but we are happy. Like when Schoolhouse distributes more information, we're happy to stay available for additional questions that folks have, and via email.
Thank you so much, Devin and Aarti, for the wonderful presentation. I hope everybody took away something from it. I definitely did. And before we sign off, I just want to do a quick ad for next week's installment, part 5, where we're going to be discussing how to engage parents and youth with lived experience in advocacy, and just going to kind of discuss some like considerations for whenever you are engaging youth and parents in advocacy, and tips on like which kinds of engagement to include them in, and just how to go about doing that. And we are going to be having 2 guests, Jordan Rourke, who is the Director of Youth Leadership and Scholarships at SchoolHouse Connection, and Yori Berry, who is the Director of Youth Partnerships at the National Network for Youth. Hope to have you all join us next week for this presentation as well. And then just going to turn you back in case anyone has any other questions for Devin and Aarti before we sign off.
Not seeing any.
Okay, all right, with no further questions, thank you all so much for joining us today. Once again, I apologize for all the technical difficulties that we had, but thank you so much for sticking through it and for staying for the presentation. Once again, hope to see everyone next week, and hope everyone has a great day. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.